Okay, now let's create our cart item component. Now we know that the items that our cart item components will be getting will be the same item as the one that we display in our collection items. Because in our collection items, we get an image URL, we get the price, we get the name, and then we also now know we'll get a quantity because we'll be pulling that item off from our state. So what we're going to do, keeping in mind these properties, is first we're going to make our component. So we'll make a cart item component and create our usual files, our cart item component.jsx and our cart item styles.sass. And inside of our cart item component, we need our React from React. And we'll also need our cart item styles. And now what we're going to set as our cart item will be a functional component where we'll destructure off those properties that we need from our item. But we'll probably pass the whole item through. So we're going to get the item, and off of it, we want the image URL, we want the price, and we also want the name. And what we'll do is we will return a div with the class name of cart item. We're also going to need an image where the source points to our image URL. And for the alt key, we'll just say that it's an item. And then inside of our div, we can say that this thing is our item details container, because looking at the actual component, on the left side is our image, but on the right side is our details. So here we're going to have a span with the class name of name, where we'll display the name. And then we'll have the same thing except for price, where we'll have the price. With our $sign. And now let's export this as the default. And we'll also need our quantity, which we know we'll also get. We'll destructure that off, and we can just explicitly say quantity times this amount. So now, if we look at our cart item styles, I have also provided for you the styling here. And now we just need to import the cart item into our cart component, cart dropdown. So let's import in our new cart item. And in our cart dropdown, we need to display it inside of this div, but we need access to those cart items. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull them off using connect off of our Redux store. And what we will write is our map state to props equals our function where we get state. And what we'll return is cart items, which will go to state. Actually, let's just destructure it off state. So we need cart, and then off cart, we need cart items. And we can just have it pass cart items like this. We'll connect with our map state to props. And now we'll destructure our cart items here. And inside of our cart items, we can map out our cart items. So cart items.map with the cart item, and we will render our cart item component where the key goes to our cart item.id, and our item is the cart item. Whoops. Got to be careful of that casing. Okay. And now, if we look at our actual code, we open up our component, and if we add our item, there it is. We're able to now add as many items as we want, and we have them displayed here. So in a similar way, once we make our checkout page, it'll be pretty much the same thing. We add the items, we'll pull them into the component, and we'll display them. This pattern now, we've seen a couple times now, is hopefully very, very easy to write. You can see that once you get used to writing the code in the reducers, there's not much complexity when it comes to how to separate out your code. That's kind of the amazing thing about Redux, is that it just follows our unidirectional data flow pattern that we need and we need to think about when writing our React code. We have these actions that trigger state changes, and then using that state, we pull them into our components, and then we display the respective elements that we need. So we will do this a couple more times, but hopefully by now, you can see the benefit of what Redux does for us and this pattern. Okay, so now that we have our cart dropdown, let's commit our code. Status, git add, git commit, created cart item component, and connected our cart dropdown with cart items reducer. Awesome. Now let's continue. Okay. So now that we have our cart as well as our ability to display cart items, we want to tackle something like displaying the number of items we have in our cart inside of our cart icon, because right now it just displays 0. Well, thinking about what we know already about pulling Redux state into local components, maybe we'd do something where we would write a map state to props, where we would pull the state in and then get the value. Now, what would this look like? Well, we would write our map state to props value, and here we would get our state, where we would destructure off cart, and from cart, we'd pull off the cart items. And maybe we'd pass in a value of item count, which is equal to accumulating the quantity on each of our cart items. Now, if we were to look at our code of what our state looks like, and let's look at the items themselves. We know that the quantity value is a number, and we want to add them all together to get the total number of items we have. Well, this is a good time to use our reduce function, if we remember, where we want to bring it down to one final value. So what we could call is something like cart items.reduce, where we would pass in 0 as the initial accumulator value, because if you remember, we want to add all of the values in our quantity. So we would get our accumulated quantity as the first argument in our first function, and then we would get the actual cart item as the second argument. And what we would return is accumulated quantity plus cart item dot quantity. And what this will do for us is it will accumulate all the number values of the quantities on all the cart items. Now, if you remember from our reducer lesson, how we added up those values together, this is doing the exact same thing, but using our quantity value. So if we can imagine we had 3 cart items and the quantities were 1, 2, 3 respectively, well, the first time our reducer code gets called, it will add 0 and 1, giving us 1, then 1 plus 2, giving us 3, then 3 plus 3, giving us 6, and we would end up with an item count of 6. So what this will do then is pass that 6 in as our item count parameter, which we would then pass in as a prop to our component. So we then destructure it off of our props and pass it in place of 0. And now if we save and we look at our app, we'll see that our count goes up for every item that we add. And we'll see that it matches. We have 2, 2, and 1, which gives us 5 total quantity of items. Now, what we've written just now is called a selector. Because what we're doing here is we are writing some kind of code that gets a state, as in the whole state object, and then pulls off just a small portion or a slice of that state. Because what we're getting is we're getting the cart, then the cart items, and then reducing over those cart items to get a new value. We're computing out a new value based off of the state. Now, the caveat to this, even though this is how Redux suggests the code to be written, is that we'll notice that whenever any reducer updates, when we remember looking at our reducer code, we're always returning a new object. Now, whenever we return a new object and Redux recomposes and rebuilds the entire state object, map state to props is actually getting called every single time, which is always passing in new props to our components. And why this is important is because this is always re-rendering our components. Now, I can actually show you how this will happen. Let's say, for example, we console log whenever map state to props gets called. And I'll say, I am being called. So even though our cart icon component only cares about cart items, what ends up happening is whenever we change the state, so let's say, for example, we're not modifying our cart state, let alone our cart item state, we're modifying our current user on our user state. If I sign in right now, you'll see that I am being called gets triggered because the map state to props inside of our cart icon component is still being called. And then if I sign out, right, again, it's just user, current user getting changed. But again, our console log is still firing, which means that our map state to props keeps firing. And this is important because our reduce is always returning a new value, because reduce doesn't know that the cart items coming in might be the exact same. So let's say we had 2 items in our cart and it reduces down to the value of 2. If these cart items come in again, but it's the exact same 2 items, reduce is still getting called. So we're still always getting a new computed value. And you might be thinking, why would that happen if the objects are the same? Well, they're actually not, because our state is always a new object, which means that everything, even if the value is identical, the object of our total state is a brand new object, which means everything inside of it, all of the data inside of it, is brand new. And that's why every time reduce gets called, whatever those cart items will also be brand new, even if the value is the same 2 cart items. Now, this is not good for performance because we don't want to re-render our component every time the state changes, especially if those state changes don't actually modify the parts of the state that our component cares about. So what we would want to do is to be able to store or cache the value of what our selector is using to compute its value. So if the cart item values don't actually change, right, and if the output of the selector doesn't change, we don't want to re-render our component. Well, what this is actually called is memoization, which is the caching of the selector's value. And we can actually achieve this kind of memoization using a library called reselect. And reselect allows us to write these selectors in such a way so that it knows that if the properties that it's pulling from the state and using are the same in the sense that their value hasn't changed and the output of the selector is not different, then it won't actually pass them into our component. It'll just pass the old value, and our React component will know not to re-render. There's also other benefits in the sense that it allows us to actually separate our selectors and make them reusable. Now let's actually take a look at how to do this. The first thing we have to do is bring in the reselect library. So inside of our terminal, let's add reselect to our node modules. Now, in order for us to use reselect and write these selector code, we have to switch up our folder structure a little bit, because we are going to move the code that we normally write inside of our map state to props into their own folder inside of the respective Redux folder that this will be related to. So for example, this cart item count might be a reusable selector, in the sense that we might want an item count in multiple places of our application. And in order for us to do that, we would add it into a new file called cart.selectors.js. Now, what we want to import from reselect is this function called createSelector. But before we use it, there's actually a couple things that we need to think about. So there's actually two types of selectors we can write. The first type is called an input selector that doesn't use createSelector. And then the second type is called an output selector that does use input selectors and createSelector to build themselves. Now I'll show you both, but let's start with the first one, which is an input selector. All an input selector is it is a function that usually takes this naming structure of select, let's say cart, for example. And what it does is it's a function that gets the whole state and just returns a slice of it. One layer deep usually. So for us, we just want the cart. So we're going to pull state.cart, because what it's going to get is the whole reducer state, and we just want this piece of it using this input selector of select cart. Now, the reason we need this input selector is because this next selector we're going to build is going to actually use createSelector. So we're going to say export const select cart items, which is a property on our cart. And how it's going to look is it's going to be our createSelector call. And what it takes is actually two arguments. The first argument is a collection, so an array, of input selectors. So we're going to say select cart. And then the second argument is going to be a function that will return the value we want out of this selector. And what we're going to get in its parameters is actually each output of the input selectors in the array, but in the order that those selectors were written. So for example, if we had another selector, say const select user equals state, right? And we just take state.user. If we were to pass this in like so, right? The arguments that we would see would be cart and then user, and then whatever we output will be the output of this selector. But because we don't need the select user, we're just going to use our select cart input selector. So our function takes this form where we get cart, and what we'll return is cart.cart items. And because we use createSelector to make this select cart item selector, it's now a memoized selector. Now, why is this important? Well, let's actually make our cart items count selector as well that we'll use in our cart icon. Let's copy this cart items reduce over. So let's make a new selector called select cart items count. and it'll be another create selector, except what we're going to pass in can also be our select cart items, right? It doesn't have to be just starting from our input selectors. But input selectors are just selectors that only return a piece of the state. It's very rare that we actually end up using such a large piece of state in our actual components. We always use these smaller, more specific selectors that have some kind of transform on them. So for example, let's say our select cart items count takes select cart items so that we get our cart items here. And what we'll output is the reduce call on those cart items. So this gives us back the total quantity of all the cart items. Well, let's pull that into our cart icons component and see how it works. So we'll import in from Redux cart selectors. And now, if we replace this code with our selector call, but we still have to pass it the state, right? So let's pass state in. And what's happening is that we're passing our whole reducer state into the selector, which then goes, okay, I need to reference select cart items, which references select cart. So it passes the state in here. It gets the cart object, which gets passed into this function, which passes out the cart items, which are select cart items count because it's relying on the selector, passes the cart items into this function, which finally reduces over and gives us our actual final cart items count, which we then pass in as item count as a prop into our cart icon component. Wow, that's a lot of words. So now if we check our application, we'll see that our code still works the exact same way, but now we have a memoized selector for this value. Okay. Now, we can actually replace our other component that uses our cart items with this selector. So the other item that we use that uses our new select cart item selector is our cart dropdown component. And here, we're just going to replace this cart items with our selector. And what we can do is import it in from Redux cart item selector. So it'll be select cart items. And now, instead of destructuring, we want the whole state so that we can pass it in like so. And this will make sure that our cart dropdown component is not getting re-rendered whenever the state changes that's unrelated to the cart items. So if we sign out, our cart items in our cart dropdown, as well as our cart items count, is not changing, and therefore our cart dropdown and our cart icon component do not need to re-render, which helps save us on performance. And we will write a whole lot more selectors as we build this application, but now we have managed to help save some re-renders off of our components. Now let's commit our code and say updating our application with reselect replaced cart selectors with memoized selectors. And let's push and proceed with our lessons. Now that we have our cart selectors, let's actually convert our user map state to props selectors to also use reselect. So let's make a new user.selector.js. And let's actually look at what we're pulling off. If I remember correctly, our header component uses it, and all it gets is the current user. So at this point, it might as well just be worth it for us to memoize these selectors using both a hidden selector as well for cart and our current user selector for our user. So we'll import in our create selector from reselect. And we're just going to get our state selector. Select user equals state, which returns state.user, and then export const select current user equals create selector. And as you remember, the first argument can be either an array of our input selectors, and then our last argument being the function that gets the return of this input selector, so our user reducer, and then we'll return user.currentUser. Now another thing is actually, let's say we imagine we had another selector. Like say we wanted to also pull off our hidden, right? So we had a select cart, and then let's say we needed the cart hidden value with our user value for some reason, right? I don't really know, but you can imagine where we would come up with a case where we might want to use multiple input selectors. And as we know from our last example, we would get cart like this, where we would be able to use it in some kind of way. But there's another way that you can actually structure your create selector, where instead of passing in an array, you just pass it in as arguments in successive order. The function in the end will still remain the same. So you can either pass all of your input selectors in the order that you want them to appear with their outputs inside of our function parameters, or we can just pass them in as an array. It really makes no difference. Personally, I like to use the array, but it doesn't really matter. So let's get rid of this because we don't need it. So now we have our current user. Let's also make the one for our hidden, and we'll just export const select cart hidden equals create selector with our select cart selector, and then we'll just return cart.cart hidden. Cart.cart hidden, okay. And now let's start replacing the components we have with the respective selectors. Now, we'll import also in another thing called create structured selector from reselect. And I'll show you what that does in a second once we bring in our respective selectors. And we want select cart hidden, and we also want select current user. Select current user. So how we've seen this done before was where we would pass in our state into our selectors, right? So let's say we want a current user. Well, we would take the whole state and then say current user points to our select current user, and then we pass the state in. Now, we know that for hidden, it's pretty much the same thing. We would call select cart hidden and then pass in the state. But if we had 5, 6 selectors, we're pretty much just doing the exact same thing 5, 6 times, right? So what we can actually do is use our create structured selector call. And instead of passing it as a function, we just pass it like so, where the properties that we want point to the correct selector. And then create structured selector will automatically pass our top level state that we get as our map state to props into each subsequent selector. And now if we look at our header component, we'll see that our code should remain the same. We still get our current user inside of our state, and it's being passed in. And our cart hidden still works as usual. Now let's see where else we have any map state to props being called. App.js. We can do this here too. We'll import in from Redux, user selectors, select current user, Now, even though we only have one selected property that we're passing into our map states props, we should still use create structured selector, because if in the future we do need to pull in more, then it's easy because we've already converted our code over to using create structured selector. And the main benefit of using it is just that it extends us a little bit less code rewrite than we would normally have to do. Select current user. Now let's actually use create structured selector in all of our other components, like our cart dropdown. So we gotta import our create structured selector, and then we can just replace this part of our code and take out the state. And then the last one is, I believe, cart icon. Yes. And then same thing. Okay. And now if we look, our code still all works the same, but now we are able to memoize all of our selectors. Okay, so moving forward now, all of our code is going to be written with reselect regarding our selectors. And this is actually the most common practice when using Redux inside of a React application while also using reselect. Okay, the next thing that we have to do is finish building our cart dropdown. So for our cart dropdown, we're missing the empty message that goes here when the user has no cart items, as well as the actual linking of our go to checkout that takes us to our checkout page. So let's first handle this empty message. So inside of our cart dropdown component, what we'll do is we will conditionally render a span or our cart items depending on whether or not the cart items array has a length that's greater than 0, right? So for us, type coercion of 0 will be false anyways. So if it's not falsy, right, if there's a value greater than 0, then we'll render our cart items. If there isn't any items, then we will render a span with the class name of empty message that says your cart is empty. Now, cart items. Now, maybe this is a good time to talk a little bit about type coercion in JavaScript. So we know that 0 is something that will evaluate to false. If I do 0 equals false, we're using the loose equal sign. So there's two types of equivalents in JavaScript. There's the double equals, and then there's the triple equals. Double equals just checks if the values of the two things are the same. And what it will also do is it will try and coerce the types on the left and the right side that we're comparing. So let's say, for example, the string of 1 and the number of 1. They'll try and coerce the value of the string over to a number. And then they'll compare the values. So once the string of 1 becomes 1, well, the values of 1 are the same. Whereas if we try and do a triple equals, we'll find that it gives us false. Because with the triple equals, that's a strict evaluation, which is looking at both the type of what we're comparing and also the value. So because the type of our string of 1 is a string, and then our type of our number is a number, then we'll get false when we try and do it this way. Now, inside of JavaScript, there are 6 types of things that are considered falsy values, which means that if we were to put them in a conditional, like an if statement or our ternary operator, then it will return false. And those 6 things are 0, false, undefined, null, not a number, and an empty string. These 6 things all evaluate to false, which is why when we set default values inside of our reducer, we tend to set them to the empty version or the falsy version of what they'll be. So if they're going to be an object, we set them by default to null. If they're going to be a number, we'll set it to 0. If it's a string, we'll set it to an empty string, right? And if it's true or false, if it's a Boolean, well, that doesn't really matter. More so what state we want that value to be inside of our reducer when it initializes. And the reason for this is so that we can conditionally render like the item itself, or we can render an empty state, right? And that's essentially what we're doing here. We're saying that if the cart items.length is equal to 0, then render an empty message. If not, then we will render out the actual cart items. And now, let's just apply some of the styles that we need to our empty message inside of our cart dropdown styles. And what we'll just say is that empty message class will get the styling where the font size is 18 pixels and our margin is 50 pixels auto. There we go. Now our message is centered. Okay. Now for our actual go to checkout button. Well, first let's create the actual checkout page. So let's go to our app.js, close these other tabs, and also make a new folder for our page called checkout. So we'll close this folder and let's make a new folder called checkout. Inside, we'll just make a basic checkout component after making our usual files, checkout.styles.sass. And inside, we'll import React from React, import in our style sheet. And usually, as we always do, we're just going to declare our checkout page and make it a basic functional component that just renders a div that says checkout page. Right? Just so that we know everything's working. Let's export this by default. And then inside of our app.js, let's bring it in. And we'll put it underneath all our other pages that we're importing. Just so that we know that all of our page components are together in the import statement, right? We can even separate it a little bit so that we can see it a little better if we want to set them by their respective sections. And then we'll just add a new route here where the exact path goes to our checkout page when we hit checkout. Now, the reason we're not doing it for shop is because eventually we'll actually do shop / and then a category like hats, jackets, men's or women's. But here we'll just add in our route, point to our checkout page because we don't have anything after checkout. Like there's no / checkout and then something else, at least not yet, that we can think of as far as our app goes. And now let's just set up our cart dropdown to have our history action to push it through. What we'll need is we will need our with router higher order component from our React router DOM. And what we'll do is we're actually going to wrap the connected function inside of our with router. And the reason we can do this is because all of our higher order components, if you remember, return components, but also take components as their arguments. So with router is just taking the component that got returned from our connect call as its component argument. Now, the order in which we wrap them matters because with router will be what passes the match history and location objects that we first covered when we were looking at our with router higher order component into the component that is being wrapped. So we want what comes out of the connect component to receive those props. Because when you wrap components like this, it actually evaluates from inside out. So we'll actually get our connected component first, which will then pass in to our with router higher order component. And this way, our actual component will have access to the props that we're looking for, which in this case is history. Because what we want this onClick to do is just fire the function that will take us to history.push/checkout. And now if we save, we see that it takes us to our checkout page. Okay, now let's continue. Now what we need to build next is our checkout page. We have to start styling it and also creating the checkout items. Now, looking at the final product for our checkout page, we see that there will be a total, some checkout items, this header, as well as this section here that has to do with payment with Stripe. Now, we'll take this one part at a time, and let's actually build our base page first. So let's have this total, and then let's have this header, as well as the checkout items, which we'll tackle after. So let's just first build the checkout page. Now, what we know that we need from the checkout page will be the header first. So let's just build that out. Now, I already have the styles for you, but we'll explore it a little bit after we set up the base HTML elements. For this, we need a class name of checkout page. And inside of our checkout page will be our checkout header. So it will just be a div that holds some of these block-like elements together. And these block elements are called header blocks. And inside of them is a span that has some text regarding what it'll say. And it will be respectively product, description, quantity, price, and remove. So let's copy this over, actually, 4 more times for each block. And this one will say product, description, price. Oh, sorry, this is quantity, price, and finally remove. Now, for the actual styling, I have them as normal. So you can just paste them into your style sheet. And let's take a quick look at what we're doing here. The main thing to focus on is that our checkout header is 100% of the page, and the page itself is 55% of the total that is available to it. So for us, that's why it's centered in this quantity amount, and it's responsive accordingly. But each header block inside of our header is 23% of the total width, except for the last child, which is our last header block, which is 8%. So 23 times 4 is 92, plus 8 gives us 100. And the reason for this is because our remove only holds the X button. So it doesn't need as much space as the other header blocks inside of our header. But now that we have our header component, let's actually bring in our cart items from our state, and then we'll build our checkout item and finish this page. So let's just first bring in all the things that we need. So we need connect from React Redux. We also need create structured selector from reselect, because we know we're going to be pulling some stuff off the state. And then we're going to bring in our actual select cart items. From Redux, cart selectors. And we'll pull off select cart items. Now let's write our map state to props. Map state to props, which will be our create structured selector. And we'll pass it in as cart items goes to select cart items. Now, as far as the total goes, we need another selector for it that will add all of the price of our items together. That selector we will add to our cart selector. And we'll call it export const select cart total? Yeah. Select cart total. That sounds pretty good. And what we'll need is we'll need all of our cart items. And it's going to be very similar to our reduce, the previous one we had for items count. The only difference is that we're going to be accumulating the value of the price of the cart item price times the cart item quantity. So we can actually copy this over and just modify it as so. Because the main thing we're trying to get is the total cost, right? And we know the cost of each item. And we know how many of each item we have. So it's pretty much just going to be the quantity multiplied by the price. So now let's bring this into our component. And then we'll say the total value is this. And then let's connect it together. And we'll add our map state to props. And then destructure off both the cart items that we're passing in now, as well as the total. And now what we can do, right after our header component, is we can put a quick little map, right, of our cart items. And we'll just show the name for now before we build our component. But let's just make sure that the parts that we can control for now are working. And we just want to render cart item.name. And then after this, we're going to have a div that has the class name of total. And inside will be the span that has our total. And now we save. And if we look, we'll see that because we have no items, right, our total is 0. But once we add our items in, we'll see that our total is updating, and there's the name of our items. Cool. So nothing new, nothing really that different from what we've done so far. But now we have our checkout page. So let's build our checkout item.
Hello, it's Andre here again. I want you to notice what Ihua has been doing so far, and he's going to continue to do throughout the course. That is, he's writing extensible code. Are you starting to feel like we're doing a lot of things over and over the same way? We're creating reducers and actions and selectors and connecting components and rendering components. And if things seem repetitive to you, that's actually a good thing. Because what we're doing is we're making things very simple. Now, we're creating a lot of files in our project, but these files are all usually under 100 lines of code. Each file is very, very simple, isn't it? We haven't written any crazy long 1,000-line algorithms. Everything is nice, small, and simple. And if you notice, Ihua makes each component very, very small and also very extensible. That is, he reuses components and features across the application so that he's not constantly doing the same thing over and over. It's okay if we're copying code that is, well, similar in, let's say, a selector or using map state to props over and over. The idea is that he's structured the project in such a way that you or I could come to the project and really easily add features, really easily add a custom button or a cart item. And this is a sign of a really good developer because when he's coding for the future as well. He knows that by thinking a little bit about how to make the code more extensible, in the future, he'll benefit as he tacks on more and more features because he can use the same functionality in one part of the app in another part of the app. And React and Redux really allows us to create extensible code. And the other word that you might be thinking of is also predictable code. There's nothing hard about what we're doing right now. Everything is super easy and predictable. At least it is once you get used to the React and Redux syntax. But at the end of the day, we're just creating really declarative code, really predictable, pure functions that can be extended. So keep an eye on that throughout the course, because this is what you want to do. You don't want to make code that makes you look impressive or clever or tough. You want code so simple that anybody can read it. Let's keep going.
Before we build our checkout item, we can actually make a small tweak to our website to make it more of a flowing user experience. Now, in order for us to go to our checkout page, we have to open up our cart dropdown and then click the Go to Checkout button. But once we get to this page, our dropdown's still open. But we know that we'll end up displaying the same information to our user, because the cart items will be reflected in the checkout items. And that just seems like a lot of redundancy. So what we can do is actually trigger a toggle whenever we click our Go to Checkout to toggle the hidden state of our cart. Because we know that in order for our user to access the Go to Checkout button, the hidden state must be false because our dropdown is open. So we know that if we were to call our toggle, we're not going to get any unexpected behavior where we don't know the state of what our hidden is. Again, because we know the dropdown must be open for them to have triggered the Go to Checkout button click. So what can we do in order to do this? Well, we can just simply bring in our toggle hidden action into our cart dropdown component from Redux, cart actions. And we'll bring in toggle cart hidden. Now, the way that we're used to doing this inside our Connect would be to write our map dispatch to props and then pass in a dispatched call of our action creator of toggle cart hidden. Now, what we might not know is that Connect actually passes dispatch into our components as a prop if we do not supply a second argument to Connect. So if we don't supply map dispatch to props as the second parameter, Connect will pass the dispatch into our dropdown, so our component, as a property. And the reason it does this is because if we need to make one-off action dispatches, well, there's no reason to write another map dispatch to props. It might be more verbose. So we can actually see this if we, for example, log out all the other props that we have access to. So just to demonstrate this, let's just return and then console log all the other props that we're not destructuring. So everything other than cart items and history. And now we'll see when we open that this is what we have. We do have access to this dispatch. So what's great about that is that now, instead of writing an unnecessary additional map dispatch to props, we can just bring in dispatch like so, expand our onClick function using a multi-line, right, which are the squiggles, and then adding another dispatch, passing in our toggle cart hidden action creator. And now if we save, we'll see that if we go to our checkout, our toggle cart hidden action is being fired. So now that we have this improved user flow, let's build out our checkout item. Now let's build our checkout item component. Now our checkout item component is going to use the cart items that we have stored in our state. Very similar to how we pull them into our cart dropdown, we're going to pull them into our checkout page and then populate that dropdown. Or not dropdown, but that list of checkout items that we see in our final. So let's actually build this component. Now let's go into our application, go to our checkout page, and right here is where we're going to map out our checkout item. So let's build the component. Let's go to our component folder and make a new one called checkout item. And inside, we need our usual checkout item.component.jsx, as well as our styles page. Checkout item.styles.sass. Now, inside of our component, we got to import React from React and import in our style sheet. Now, as usual, I've included the style sheet for you under your resources, and you're just going to copy it and put it inside of your style sheet. Now, the main thing to note is that the width of these three categories is the same as the width of the three headers or the four headers that we have. The only difference is that there's a container for the actual image and the image itself sits inside. And we'll see what that looks like in terms of how we're laying it out in the HTML. But that's how we're able to align them together. So what we're going to do is we're going to declare our const checkout item. And it's going to be a functional component that returns this div with the class name of checkout item. And then inside, we're going to have that image container I was telling you about, which will just be a div with the class name of image container. And then inside of that, we're going to have our image. Now, the reason why we use a container for our image is because it's easier for us to control the size of this section that holds our image. We can throw some padding on it, right? And then give it that width. And then have our image inside be constrained by it. And by constrained, I just mean that we set the width and height based off of what the size of this container is. And we can apply the padding here without having to affect the other sections. Because maybe we don't want the same kind of padding on those. It's just easier to put the image that we have inside of this container. Now, we're going to provide the alt key of item. And this is just for those screen readers, because when people who have disabilities that use a screen reader for the browser, whenever they hit an image, they can't actually see the image. So they get read out what that description will be. And for us, it'll just be item. It's just easier for us to say, if they know that it's an image and then they know item, by the point that they actually use the screen reader, they know the item name, so they don't really need to have a full understanding, perhaps, of what the image will be. Next, we're going to add our spans. And here is where we're going to use name. And then let's just repeat this for the respective quantity, price, and then the last one, this will not be a span, it'll actually be a div, because this is what's going to hold our remove button. Now, our remove button is going to be a UTF-8 wingding. Now, you can actually find a good list of them right here at this W3 Schools link that I'm going to put on your screen right now. Now, what UTF-8 is, it's essentially a standard that most browsers have that represents what characters they're able to display or they're able to recognize, right? So all the letters that we type that we're most familiar with, those all fall into the UTF-8 categorization. But there are also these other additional symbols that we can render, right? That our browser knows what they represent. And we're just going to use this X for our X. And the reason for it is because it's more balanced, right? It's essentially like an icon that our browser is naturally aware of. So in order for us to use it, we can just copy this text, right? In fact, if you hit try it, you'll see where it's demonstrated. We have to apply this ampersand hashtag before we actually use the number, and then we got to put a semicolon, right? And that's that same number. So inside of here, we're just going to put this here, and then we're actually going to pass in our props. Now, we know that we're going to use the card items that we have in our store, but we're also going to pass in the full item. And the reason why we want to pass in the full item rather than spread the props into our components, as we would any other way, is because we know that we eventually want to increase and decrease this quantity, as well as hit the remove to remove all of the items that are in the store regarding this card item. Now, passing the full item is mandatory because we know with our cart items, when we wrote our cart action add item, we needed the whole item in order for it to work. So if we want to toggle and increase the quantity, we're pretty much just firing our add item call. But this time we also want it to be done inside of this component. So we just got to follow the same requirements as our add item action creator. So inside of our checkout item, we're just going to make sure to pass the whole item as a prop as well. But we can just destructure off the other values that we need in order to apply them into the component. So we're going to need name, we're going to need image URL, we're going to need price, and we're going to need quantity. Now that we have our values, inside of our image, we're just going to set the source equal to the image URL. As for the name, we're just going to render the name. Same thing with quantity and price. And then let's just export this out as the default and bring it into our checkout page component. And here we'll just import it in. Checkout item component. And then instead of rendering this cart item name, we'll just render out our checkout item and pass cart item in as a prop. We'll also make sure to set our key equal to our cart item ID. And now if we save, go back to our application, add some items, and go to our checkout, we'll see that we have our component. Now, before we continue with building in the remove feature as well as decreasing and increasing the quantity, let's just commit our code. So let's go back to our terminal and let's check what we've added. So we've done our checkout page and we'll say added checkout page, checkout item component, and updated cart to use selectors from reselect. And now let's push it up and build our checkout item functionality. Now, in the last lesson, we created our remove button with our X icon wingding. Now we actually need to create the functionality in our Redux code in order to clear this item out. Now, this is actually going to be very similar to what we did from a Redux standpoint as far as when we added items. And you can imagine it must be similar because what we're doing is we're trying to update our cart items reducer value inside of our cart reducer so that we clear out an item regardless of its quantity whenever we hit this X button. So of course we now know that we need to dispatch a new action that will clear out that item based on an item that we pass in as the payload for this new action that we're trying to write. So let's actually do this. Now, we already know what we need to do from a Redux standpoint. We need to first make the new action type. So inside of our cart types, let's make a new one called clear item from cart, which is equal to the string value of clear item from cart. Now, what we want to do with the actual action is we want to make a new action that dispatches the new clear item from cart that we just made. So we will call it clear item from cart as well, which gets an item. So it's a function that gets an item as a property, just like our add item. And in an exactly similar way as our add item action creator, we're going to set the type equal to our new clear item from cart and set the payload equal to the item that we're trying to clear. Now that we have this, we need to actually update our reducer so that our reducer removes the appropriate item from the array. So inside of our cart reducer, we're going to make a new case that will listen to our new action. So this will be our cart action types.clear item from cart. And what it will return is going to be a new object where we spread everything in our state, but we also want to update our cart items so that now it will return a new array without any instance of that item that we're trying to clear away. Now, the code that we need to write here in our reducer is going to be a filter. If you remember from filter, we're just going to call on our existing cart items array that exists on our state right now, and we're going to filter it, passing in the appropriate cart item. And then what we'll say is that if the cart item ID does not match the action payload, which we know is the item we're trying to remove, .id, then I want you to keep it. If that cart item ID does match the item's ID that we're trying to remove from our payload, then I want you to filter it out. Now, as you remember, filter returns us back anything that yields true inside of the actual function as the return of the function. Here, what it's saying is that if the cart item's ID does not match the item we're trying to filter, then return true. So we'll keep that item, right? Because we want to keep any item where the ID is not the one that we're trying to clear out. So that's what filter does, and it gives us back a new array. With this, we've made our clear item from cart. We just need to now bind it to our checkout item component. So what we're going to do is inside of our checkout item component, we are going to now import in connect because we need to bind our actual new action to our component, very similar to how we did it with add item. So we'll just import that in as clear item from cart from our Redux folder, cart actions. Then we need to make our map dispatch to props, which is equal to this function that gets dispatch from the Redux store. And then we will return our new clear item. And with this clear item function, we are going to set it to pretty much what we had earlier with our add item. The only difference is that now we're using our new clear item from cart function. So we'll make sure to dispatch clear item from cart, passing in our item. As you see, this shape is very similar to the code that we wrote inside of our collection item when we map dispatched our add item function. And then we just have to make sure to connect, passing in null and our map dispatch to props, wrapping our checkout item. So now we need the cart item. So instead of destructuring these values off here, remember, by doing this and destructuring these values this way, one layer deep, so we're pulling cart item off the props object and then pulling these values off of the cart item, we actually don't have access to the cart item property. So what we need to do is we need to again do an explicit return in this function and just make sure to set the const of these values inside of the squiggly lines of our function definition. And now we'll have access to our cart item as well as our new clear item function that we're passing in. So now on our remove button, we can do our on click where we create a new anonymous function that will call our new clear item function that we're passing in as a prop, and we'll pass the cart item in like so. And now we have our clear item working. So this is very similar to our add item functionality that we wrote a couple lessons ago. Except now the main difference is that our reducer changes its functionality. Instead of doing our add item to cart, we're doing this new filter, which returns us a new array with the appropriate item filtered out. Now if we go back to our application, we go back to our shop, we add some items, And let's say I wanted to get rid of brown cowboy. If I hit the X, we see that it got removed. We see our clear item from cart action being fired. And of course, we see our cart items array reflecting the new changes. And just like that, we've now built in our clear item from cart feature. That was actually pretty simple. It's pretty much just the same pattern that we were used to from writing our add item feature. And you'll see that much of Redux is pretty much just this pattern that we've written twice now. We mainly want to do something with our reducer, passing in some specific object as a payload. Maybe not even an object, maybe it's some property. And what we do is we just want to update our reducer, so we want to update our state values accordingly depending on what we're getting. We'll actually see this in a bit more detail once we add in our arrows and we reuse our add item, as well as make a new remove item feature inside of our checkout item. We'll do that in the next lesson. So now let's build in our quantity increase and decrease feature. So looking at the final product, what we want to be able to do is have these arrows that are able to increase the quantity of an item or decrease the item. And we're able to do this because the right arrow fires our add item action that we've already created before, but also this new remove item action that's going to be very similar. Now, alternatively, one thing we have to consider when building these features is what is the full functionality. So one case might be what happens if we're on the last quantity and then we hit decrease again. Well, we see that actually removes the item. So we have to consider that into the way that we build this feature, because we want to be able to scope out everything that we need before we start building it. Now, we know that we need to add in these arrows to our checkout item component, and we also know that we need, at the very least, one more new cart action for remove item. So let's start building this out. The first thing we have to do is add these arrows to our component. So let's go into our code and let's modify our checkout item component. So the first thing we have to do is add the arrows in. And they're actually going to be using these Unicode 8 wingdings, just like the X that we have for our remove button, except we'll use a leftward and a rightward facing arrow. And they're going to be in divs with the class name of arrow. Oops. Got to make sure to keep them open. Let's copy this and paste this down. And the wingding code that we're going to use is going to start with ampersand hashtag, and it's 10094 semicolon. So this one is our leftward facing arrow. And now the rightward facing one is just one number increased. So it's going to be ampersand hashtag 10095 semicolon. And now if we save, we also need to wrap our quantity in a span. And the span will have the class name of value. And the reason we want to add these actual elements is so that we can apply better styling to it. Because right now, if we look at our application, we'll see that if we add an item, that it's not styled yet. It's vertically aligned, which we don't want. So what we want to do inside of our style sheet for checkout item is change this quantity to have display flex, which will put them in that horizontal side-by-side alignment based on how much space there is. Now, inside of here, we want our arrow class names to have a cursor of pointer so that the user can tell that it's a clickable element. And then for our value, we want a margin 0, 10 pixels. So 0 on the top and bottom, 10 pixels on the left and right. And now if we check again, we see that it looks how we want it to. Okay, now let's actually bind the functionality that we want to our left and right click. Now we know that our right click already is using the add item action that we already have, so we don't need to build this one. But the remove item one seems like it's kind of daunting because not only does it have to decrease the quantity, but we also have to consider how to remove it. But we've already done that if you think about it with our remove action, right? We've done something very similar. So our code, much of it has already been something we've written before. It's just the composition is going to be a little different. But it'll be interesting because it's going to combine all of these concepts that we've already been tackling and learning. So let's go into our cart types to add a new action string type called remove item. And then let's go to our action creators for our cart actions. And let's make a new one called remove action. Remove item. And it's going to be cart action types dot remove item. And the payload will still be the item, exactly like our add item. Now what we want to do is modify our reducer. So inside of our cart reducer, we are going to make another case right underneath our add item for cart action types dot remove item. And we're going to return an object spread in the state because we want all the properties, right, that aren't changing. But the ones that we do want to change is cart items. And we're going to write a new utility function that will return us the array with the modified cart item with the decreased quantity or the removed item from our existing cart items if it was the last one. So let's go to our cart utils and write this function. So let's think about what we need to do. We need to first figure out if there's an existing cart item already inside of our cart items, which we know there must be because we're decreasing it, right? So we know there must already be one. And then what we want to do, we need to check if the quantity is 1 so that we can remove it. Otherwise, decrease the quantity. So it sounds like there's a lot, but it's actually quite similar to the code that we've already written. So let's get started. So we'll say remove item from cart is equal to this function. So we know that we need the cart items because we got to check the existing cart items to see if our cart item to remove is inside of it, right? We need that existing item. So this code here is going to be very similar. It's going to be cart items.find, and we're going to check, just like our add item to cart, if the cart item.id is equal to our cart item to removes ID. Now, if we have the existing cart item, what we're going to check is only if the quantity is equal to 1. So we're going to say if the existing cart item's quantity is equal to 1, then we want to filter it out just like we did when we ran our clear item code, right? Just like this filter. It's the exact same idea. We just want to remove it and we want to keep all the ones where the cart item's IDs don't match the one we're trying to remove because that's what filter needs. We're going to say return cart items dot filter where the ones of the cart item dot ID does not match our cart item to remove dot ID because we want to keep those ones, right? So just like before, filter keeps the values where the function returns true. So if the ID is not the one that we want to remove, then we want to keep them. If it does, right? If it is, then I want to remove that cart item. Now, alternatively, if the quantity is not 1, and we know there is the existing cart item because there must be, right? What we're going to return is we're going to say cart items dot map. And very similar to this function, it's going to be cart item where we are going to just say cart item dot ID is equal to cart item to remove .id, right? If it is the same one, we want to decrease the quantity. We're going to return a new object, spread in the cart items, right? All the properties, except we want the quantity to go to cart item quantity minus 1. Otherwise, what we want is to return just the cart item. And that's all there is to it. If the existing item's quantity is at 1, remove it. Otherwise, decrease the quantity, right? And keep every other cart item the exact same because they don't need to be modified. And now that we have this code, let's just bring this into our reducer. And we can just do state.cartItems and action.payload. And now we have our reducer set up. We have our action creator. Let's add this to our checkout item. Now, let's just bring in add item and remove item and modify our map dispatch to dispatch them. Add item goes to item, dispatch, add item, where the payload, whoops, cannot type, is our item. And similarly, remove item will dispatch our remove item, where the item is our payload. Now let's destructure them in and bind them to the on click. So on our leftward facing arrow, we want our remove item with our cart item. And then on our rightward facing arrow, we want add item with our cart item. And now, if we add some items, we'll see that we're able to increase on click of the smaller arrow, decrease, and remove. All our functionality is in. And by combining everything we've learned up until this point, we've built a pretty robust feature. So this is pretty cool. We've managed to actually do everything that we need for this item toggling. And it's just building upon all the same code and ideas that we've already explored so far. It was just a matter of putting it together and mentally figuring out what we needed to do in order for our feature to not only decrease the quantity, but also remove it from our cart items if it was the last quantity. While some of these features look kind of complex at first glance, if we just tackle it one step at a time and think about what it is that we need to do, we're able to accomplish and build them pretty easily. Now let's commit our code. And let's just say added, add item, and remove item functionality to checkout item component. And git push. Okay, now let's continue.